What do you make of what you're seeing out of the US now? Each day we're hoping that things will calm down, and they seem to just be inflaming even more.
Good morning, Annalise. Look, what I'm looking at now is sort of a repeat of the civil rights protests and the anti-war movement in the 1960s, during which time, between 65 and 68, about 25 American cities burned. You know, they all start out as a protest, and sometimes they segue into riots. But keep in mind what Thomas Jefferson said in 1787: sometimes the tree of liberty needs a little bit of water, and it's the people can resist the leaders at the end of the day. And I saw this morning on one of the Australian networks, they had this down as a race riot. As you can see from the cameras, from the pictures, this is not a race riot. This is a social protest. It's got red people and blacks and browns, and white people, and everybody else in there. It's not that kind of racial thing. Now it does sometimes turn into a mob. And mobs can be very serious. I mean, that's how the American Revolution started. That's how the French Revolution started, and the Russian Revolution. So governments are very wary of the mobs. But keep in mind, we have a perfect storm here. We have the denial of justice to a man who's killed in front of social media at a time of social claustrophobia from the pandemic. So got all these things building up, and these people hit the streets, and it goes off in different directions. But look, clearly 95% of the protests are legitimate protesters. The Attorney General and the Governor of Georgia have suggested that outside influences are coming in, so-called anti-fascist groups, or maybe very right-wing white supremacists. It's possible that there are other people have gotten in, but it's very dangerous to say that outsiders are coming in, because that's what the sheriff said in Selma, Alabama, when Martin Luther King showed up with the Southern Christian Leadership Movement, that there were some outsiders were coming in. But look, this will blow over. Will we do much about it? I hope so. This is about institutional racism. And look, this is showing a lot of Americans that things have to be done. Now, look, you can't make racism go away overnight. It might even be in the DNA of certain nations. But you can, of course, legislate public policy. You could legislate what the police can do and what they can't do. I mean, you can have greater parameters out there about what happens. But, you know, every time a policeman kills somebody in custody, the police unions complain that nothing should happen. Even the Supreme Court gives the police a little bit of leeway. And this is something that has to be dealt with in terms of legislation. But look, this will blow over.
And if we look at it, sorry to interrupt you there, but I did just want to ask, when you look at it from the lens of the fact we are in an election year, this has been building up for quite some time. We can see that pressure, in particular about access to health, and it does seem like an unusual thing to talk about in these circumstances, but when you have a pandemic that's killed 100,000 Americans, there is a disproportionate lack of access to healthcare in Americans for Black Americans. And so that would undeniably be factoring so much of the frustration among the African-American community as well.
The pandemic has taken a disproportionate number of lives among blacks and browns, and I might even add poor whites in Appalachian places like this. Sometimes these protests are more about zip codes than anything else. And these inner cities, they haven't had much done there since the 1960s or 70s. That is, people haven't spent much money on them. And you know, they become the center of where a lot of the non-whites live. And we're talking about we're talking about Minneapolis, we're talking about the city itself, not the suburbs. We're talking about Chicago, not the suburbs. Same thing in New York. And these inner city places, they get very desperate. And sometimes they just turn on themselves. I mean, in the case of Minneapolis, we have a legitimate protest, which morphs into a riot, and they destroy 170 Black-owned businesses in their neighborhoods. So what's the point of that? That's why the governor of Georgia and the Black mayor of Atlanta are jumping up and down, because these people, and I might also add Mayor Lightfoot in Chicago, they're destroying their own livelihoods and the lives of their own people. But look, this is something I suppose we could have expected. Donald Trump will try to turn this into an election campaign that is law and order, the way Richard Nixon did in 1968. But keep in mind that the Black community is going to want a little more out of Joe Biden than what he's talking about. Biden's talking about getting back to normal. These people, this community, particularly the blacks and the browns and non-whites, they don't want normal. They want Biden to do something very positive. So I think Biden's on notice, and the president's got his issue here if he wants to go with this one. He hasn't done much to water this thing down and to suggest that this is a radical left happening is sort of crazy. What we have is a small element of criminals. I don't care whether they're left or right, who are looting and fighting.
And I just want to clarify for our viewers, these are actually live pictures coming out of New York at the moment that we have here of the protests there. And it is that fine line between the peaceful protests and then the rioting that does start. We see it coming in at night. What did you make, Joe Siracusa, of the fact they've had to call in the National Guard at the level they've said they've never done since World War II into action? And also that tweet from Donald Trump that's since been blocked by Twitter saying that the looting starts, the shooting starts. That's incredibly inflammatory thing for a president to be saying about his own citizens.
Yes. Well, look, a lot of people are elected on maintaining law and order, that is, to protect the property rights of people and their CBDs. And they regard that as very serious stuff. Now, in Miami, that particular fellow talked about if there's rioting, then the guns come out. But look, we've had not in Minneapolis, but we've had high concentrations of the National Guard were called out in the 1960s. They were called out for the Vietnam War, anti-Vietnam, and for the Civil Rights Movement. I mean, I've seen the National Guard in my own lifetime, and it's not as unprecedented. You know, for people who haven't seen this in a generation, these are extraordinary pictures, particularly the damage and the arson and the looting. We haven't seen this in a long time, but we have seen this in American life in the last 50 or 60 years. We had the same thing in the 1930s, and the Chicago riots in 1919, and the Houston riots in 1917. These things, they come and go, and do we do much about it? So people say to me, look, will there be much about social justice after this is over? Well, look at Sandy Hook and all the terrible gun massacres in America. And we didn't move an inch on gun control. So I don't know how much harder, but look, in some ways, the 95% who come out and resist the government, that is, they're complaining about the leadership, not only the Democrats and the Republicans, but everybody who runs these cities and states, that they have to do more for the black community, the brown community, and everybody else in between. So, you know, in that sense, it's a very healthy development. Of course, when it morphs off into a riot with arson and looting and damage, then it becomes something else. And I don't think the protesters should be lumbered with that. They're doing a pretty good job on making their feelings felt. These other people who are coming in, they're not part of the legitimate protest movement. And it's unfortunate and happens all the time. But you notice this. There are 22 riots going on, or protests going on in the United States, 1,700, 2,000 arrests. And not many people have been killed yet. I mean, the police have shown enormous restraint because they don't want to turn this into a bloodbath. You know, in these states, they're open carry states, so people can go and get their guns if they want to. So in this sense, it's relatively peaceful. There have been a few deaths, unfortunately, but not as much. But the people are pushing back. This is the last thing the blacks and browns and poor whites have in America, is the ability to resist. And they are surrounded by white middle-class liberals and progressives of all kinds. We have grandmothers and grandfathers there, and we got kids, you know, about 10 or 12 with their parents. This is widespread. It's not just black. So when I saw that clip this morning that talked about race riots in America, this is not a race riot. This is a protest that has gone wrong.